So what is your particular connection then, Ursula, with Silverburn?
Well, myself and my husband moved to Leven in 2003. And that's the first time I came across Silverburn, because we used to really like walking in the park. We lived in Links Road, just down behind the prom, beside the golf course. And we would walk along the beach and through the Mile Dyke and up into the park and round the park. And the park was just lovely. It was quite overgrown then and not particularly well maintained. I think at that stage, it was possibly the council was kind of running out of steam with it. But we used to like walking around the park, looking at the trees, going right through, up and across the road into Blackety Side Farm and across that way. So that's when we first came across the park, really. I do remember that then it was not long after we moved that I think they started to, a couple of years, they ran the consultation on what should happen to the park. And I think a lot of the local people were quite concerned as to what would happen. At one stage, there was a suggestion it could be turned into housing, which didn't go down terribly well with anybody. But luckily, it was pointed out that under the terms of the agreement through which the Russell family had handed it over, that was not on. It had to be kept for people of Leven, and it had to be kept as an area of recreation and peace and things like that. And so we were very keen and very pleased to hear at the time when Feet got the contract to actually start trying to regenerate the place. Generally speaking about Silverburn, when in the earlier days we used to walk around, obviously the flax mill was quite run down as well, but I'd heard about the Polish connection, the history of the Polish connection, which interested me particularly because in my past I lived in Poland for 3 years, so I had a particular graph, as they say, for Polish connections. And I remember reading a few things about how the Polish officers were billeted there during the war, and I thought, oh, that's I like places that have got a different pattern of history to them. And so then again, moving on with the actual when Feet announced they were going to really try and see if they could raise the money to regenerate the actual flax mill and refurbish it and turn it into a useful or interesting place. I thought, well, that's particularly interesting to me because in my own family, we have a long history with flax on my mother's side, going back 6 generations, right the way back to 1796. I think an ancestor of mine was listed in the flax rolls of people who were flax growers in Ireland in 1796. I think they were giving them the new technology of spinning wheels at the time, and that was the reason. So I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I was looking into more of the actual role of Silverburn then, the mill. I mean, it didn't operate for very long as a flax mill, it would turn out, but it was the fact that it was actually a big industrial process, and they were trying to again introduce the new technology of the special approach to retting and things like that. I thought that was really pretty interesting because flax itself, my grandfather grew flax in his farm in Monaghan, and my mother remembers it as being, she described it as a filthy crop. It was really nothing very romantic about it at all. I think if you were flax growing or flax processing, it was not pretty. It was very hard work. He grew flax as part of a mixed crop, I think, with corn and potatoes, but he also worked in a local scutching mill. And I think that took a very, very heavy toll on him. The dust and apparently he would come home and his eyes would be streaming and things like that. So my mother was not very keen on flax, but it was something that had gone. I mean, it was something that they were used to. They'd had had been in the family for a long time.
Did he say anything else about? It was very dusty and unpleasant in there. Did he say anything about the machinery? Was he working with machinery?
I think the local scutching mill, it wouldn't have been on the scale of the likes of the size of Silverburn. I think there was a number of small mills. Rather than it being done by hand at home, they had introduced some kind of machinery for speeding up the process. But there was still a lot of physical manual labor involved, and the dust, I think, went absolutely everywhere. And he himself was actually partially disabled. He couldn't really use his arms fully. because he had been injured in a shooting. His elbows had been shot out when he was a young man. So I think it was very, very hard going on him. In fact, his brother, my great uncle, came and stayed to do all the work on the farm because of that. But he then apparently was a champion flax sewer. Apparently, this was a skill. The sewing of flax was a big skill, and so he was in great demand in all the local area for sewing the flax. So that was to me why the whole idea of the mill was of particular interest to me, because I remembered all of these things. I mean, I'm very keen on the preservation of industrial history, but at the same time, we shouldn't romanticize it. It was really not an easy life.
Yeah. Did he ret his flax on the farm in the fields?
I think so. From what my mother was saying, yes, because she had memories of him being ankle deep in water.
Right.
So yes, so he will have been doing some of that. And I think again, I think when she was talking about it being a filthy crop, I think might have been to do with partly the smell, because it doesn't smell nice, as well. So yeah, altogether it was something people had to do, obviously, to make a living, but yeah, not through choice, as it were, you know. So
Can I ask, when you started visiting the park, what condition was the flax mill in at that time?
when I started visiting the park, I would just say it was a rundown, boarded up building. I think there were a few sort of like danger signs because it wasn't in good condition. At that stage, the Dower House, which is now on the point of absolute collapse, was in slightly better condition. The roof hadn't completely caved in at that point. And the other house, the Silverburn house, still existed, because it was burned down about maybe 7 or 8 years ago now. But it was still in existence, and people were still using it. I think there were workshops and things held there. Various craft fairs and workshops maybe being held in the Silverburn House then, or training sessions. But it was definitely still in use.
Could I ask you then? Do you remember the day that you heard it had been burnt down? Do you remember that day?
Yes. I think I don't think I was in Leven. I think I was abroad at the time. But following it on social media, I saw the news, and it was just horrible. It was very bad news, because I knew the efforts that were going into trying to improve the park, and you just thought, well, this is a common problem, it would appear, across Levenmouth, with youngsters and arson, and not good. And it was basically very bad news, and I thought very disheartening for all the people involved in trying to improve the park. But then again, these things happen, and you have to move on. And I think they're going to try and make a good use of that space that the house was on. Because one of the things that has always struck me about the redevelopment of Silverburn, is how it's very, very much a grassroots type of development. The top-down approach where the council ran the park didn't work. It obviously, maybe it's not the job of a council, I don't know, but the park had become very overgrown and neglected, and that. And then the start of regenerating it, as soon as Pete took it over, you could notice a difference, because there were crews of, teams of litter pickers volunteering out, picking the litter and clearing back the undergrowth. And all of a sudden, you could actually make your way to see the redwood trees, which you couldn't actually see before, because there was so much, so much growth. I mean, you just couldn't get at them. And they immediately began to make a difference by doing that routine maintenance, which had been neglected for quite a long time. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why it's been working. I think there's been an awful lot of hard work going in, particularly on the part of the Feet folk and Duncan and his colleagues, to really, really keep it going. But it's been because there's been huge local support, I think, and a will for it. I mean, part of the work that I've been doing with the park, I've been working more as conducting evaluation for them. partly initially to do with the National Heritage Lottery, and then with some of the other organisations, they were able to obtain grants from to help. And as part of that, we actually were doing surveys of local people to sort of say, well, why are you visiting the park? What do you do there? How do you use it? How long do you spend there? And the actual positive response of the vast majority of people was very heartening. The appreciation of the work that had gone in, how people remembered visiting the park as a child, and they were so pleased to see it coming back into life again. And so in that sense, I don't think it would have worked if it had been top down. It clearly wasn't working top down, but by actually harnessing the energies and the input of people around about and all the volunteers that come, I think that's been crucial and will be crucial to the park's existence in the future, which is why it's very important that it's actually being run as a social enterprise, because with the profits reinvested for the park maintenance and to support the charity, I think that's very important again, because people are less keen, obviously, if it was a purely commercial enterprise, but if it's actually being run for the community, I think that helps. Which is the other thing about, I do want to mention the work we've been doing, because if something is a public good, the way the park is, and that's literally an economic public good, which is a very specific definition, quite often the value it generates is overlooked because there aren't big money flows attached to it. So quite often people put too much emphasis on, well, does it raise money, or does it do this, or does it do that? Remember, the park is free to use, free for people to go in and come out of. That, and then with the flax mill itself being regenerated as a focus to provide activities, to give people access to learning about the history, etc. There's there's a huge potential within the local community for that to be a sort of pivotal hub. And we wanted to kind of look at how can you use robust methodology to actually put a value on that. And so working, this is because this is the nature of our work. And my husband's an economics professor. And basically we were saying, well, look, this is the skills we have. These are the skills we have. Why can we apply them to try and help elucidate that? So, for example, one of the first reports we did was a report on the social and economic impact of the park and the mill and its potential. We're going to be updating that this year. But so apart from the general thing, the mill will create jobs in the local area and a bit of economic activity, attract visitors, etc. The thing is, during lockdown, they were collecting visitor numbers for the first time. And during the period of lockdown, when you remember, people weren't allowed to travel more than 5 miles from their home. And they were collecting visitor numbers for the first time then, and there were over 151,000 visits in a 1-year period during lockdown. And at that stage, because we had a survey, people were saying how important the park had been to them during that period, that pretty terrible period, obviously, of COVID, where this was a place they could get out, they could go in the open air, they could bring the children. And that was really, really important. So in looking at that, we did an initial study to try and estimate the value to the local community of just using the park as a leisure facility during lockdown. And the park itself, using that particular methodology, came up with over £1 million worth of social value from the leisure use alone. Because remember, park's free to use. People will say, oh, it's just a park. But actually, by looking at the value of the time people spent, because that's the way we looked at it, if people spend time in a place, it's worth something to them. So by looking at the value of the time they spent in that year lockdown, we conservatively estimated over £1 million in social value generated in the local area. Now, the reason I'm talking about the money figures is because money figures tend to get attention. People tend to ignore something. Oh, it's nice, it's a good thing. But that figure is really just an indication of how important the place is, I think, locally. This year, we're hoping to do a more extensive study looking at the park as and more holistically, looking at everything they're doing and applying, well, fundamental economics to actually show how you can demonstrate the value being generated locally by something for which there is not necessarily a money flow. So hopefully we'll be able to do that, and that will also contribute towards helping the park moving forward. Because I think people need to realise, and obviously government and the powers that be need to realise, that things that aren't necessarily commercial can still have enormous social and economic value in an area, and basically deserve to be supported for that.
Is you've got actually really a lighthouse view in a way of what's going on. Tell me about the confidence and the community and the feeling about it all as it grows.
It's an interesting one, is where to start. Okay, so I'll just start with some of the discussions I had with volunteers. Because one of the projects Fate was running in the park was a project for volunteers to become involved in learning how to do maintenance tasks in the park. And it was a whole mix of people. Some people had been out of work for a while. Some people had mental health difficulties. Others actually simply wanted to join in. So there was a whole mix of different people there for different reasons. And talking to them, I was really quite taken with their comments. How one chap said he suddenly had a sense of belonging. He'd been feeling fairly useless and out of it, and now this gave him a focus and a sense of belonging coming back in. Another person had said they didn't know how to cook. It was a funny thing, but actually, as part of this volunteer project, they'd been actually shown how they could use vegetables from the cottage garden in the Silverburn to make soup, so that they were able to then make soup for themselves. And that was something they'd actually been fairly institutionalized most of their life, and they hadn't learned to cook. Now that's kind of a simple thing, but sometimes it's as a whole combination of these small things that actually build up to developing senses of community, I think. So if I start with that, but thinking back to comments from some of the survey comments, people were saying there was things like, we're so privileged to be able to bring our children up here. I remember that was one comment, that they could bring their children to the park and to do that. And there are so many activities. The park is providing a focus for, children's groups, toddlers groups, a place that schools take school pupils to do nature trails and things like that. And if you look on social media, on Facebook, there's something going on in the park practically every week, not something, 2 or 3 things every week. And I think it's actually providing a focus and a hub for activities that in a lovely open space that's being cared for, that definitely is an asset. Now, more formally, obviously, with the new rail link, it's part of the whole regeneration of Leavenmouth as an area that for years, and one of the things we realised when we first moved to Leven, we felt Leavenmouth had been pretty much abandoned. It was very, very run down. It's still a very highly deprived area. And sometimes you felt, this goes back to where I think the success of Silverburn is partly because it's been grassroots and bottom up. I think the powers that be, sometimes you got the feeling that they'd left it to rot. And it needed people to come and sort of say, no, we want to do something with this place. And I think that's the park and the whole work towards regenerating the flax mill has actually provided a focus. It's not the only one. There are other activities going on in Leavenmouth, for example, in Buckhaven. There's an organisation called Clare that does a lot of really interesting community work. And indeed, in our house on Licks Road, we had our little residents group that tried to do all the putting out flowers in the middle of the road, and all those sorts of environmental improvements actually make a place nice to look at as people are walking through it. So there are things going on, but Silverburn was definitely, I think, a major part of that. It used to be Leven used to be a big holiday centre years ago. Indeed, my husband is a Glaswegian, and he used to, in the 1960s, he came to Leven as a child for his holidays. And then obviously over the years that all went. But now I think there's a real potential for it to come alive again. You've got the rail link, you've got places like Silverburn coming alive. I think the flax mill is going to be really important in attracting people and putting it back on the map. Yeah, but I just think it's of pivotal importance in the area.
how do you see Silverburn in 10 years' time?
Hopefully thriving. I think it will, because the energy is there to make it so. I see the flax mill itself as a centre, being very important as an event hub, a place where you can have people have things like, I think, like local crafts, workshops, etc. They're already starting to hold lovely, I think, practically open air weddings in the park. I see it as being a really useful place and a facility for the local area, because there's very little. I mean, there really is very, very little. As part of the, I think, the work in supporting the application to the Heritage Lottery, a number of people, including the folk who were looking into the history and the interpretation and how to interpret the history, they were like pointing out there's nothing really in the area in Leavenmouth to celebrate or to focus or to highlight its local history. There's a small centre in Methil, but beyond that, and also just facilities. There's very few facilities in the area, which is amazing, because if you look across the Forth, you're looking at North Berwick, which has recently been declared, the nicest place in Scotland to live. Well, the area has just as many lovely things as North Berwick. It has, it has golf courses, it has sea, it has scenery, it has the park, all of that. There's no reason why, particularly now there's a rail link, it could not become, as prosperous in its own way as that. And I think it needed vision. And I think the people who started all of this really, well, the Russell family actually for giving the park to Leven, so I think they really deserve that credit for them doing that. The people who drew up the agreement in the first place, which said it had to be kept as a place for Leven, so it couldn't be turned into houses and sold off, and also then the people from Feet, I think they really had the vision to see they could make this a positive asset, and it could for the charity itself. I mean, the Feet charity its work for people with mental health difficulties is it's quite inspiring, and for them to see that the park could actually help be part of that, be part of that, a part of the component that it's mutually beneficial. It means the park's available and for the whole community, but also it's a perfect place for people to use and to basically help. Everything. I mean, everything. Everything I've read about it, and then from what my mother was saying, it was extremely hard, and it was very hard on people. Very, very hard on people. It was not something romantic at all, though the flowers are pretty. I hope in the kind of tracking of the history and the interpretation that displays in the flax mill, that's pointed out as well, because I think sometimes there is a tendency to over romanticize the past. Oh, I remember the vehemence with which my mother said it. She said flax is a filthy crop, and she was so vehement about it. It was sort of, no, let's not go back there. I do think Duncan and his colleagues are doing a fantastic job, and the energy to keep it going. I mean, I think it's not hard. It's not easy to do these things, but I think it's very, very important, and I think it's going to be very, very important for the area. And there will always be people. People will criticize at the same time. Nothing's ever perfect. Can't keep everybody happy, but it's even in the surveys when what do people like about the park, what they don't like about the park, evenly split between the people who love it as a place to bring their dogs for walks and the people who hate people bringing their dogs for walks. So there's always, you have to get a balance between different things. It is a public good, it is a social, and it's being run by a social enterprise, but it does have to be sustainable. That which means there will be things they will do and not everybody will agree with. They do, and they will have to charge for some things, but not for the open access to the park. But there's a balance between also when you talk about a piece of quiet recreation, there will be times when they have a music festival, so it won't be quiet all the time. But again, it's getting a balance between different activities that appeal to different parts of the community, and making it a lively place. Being a place of quiet recreation doesn't mean a fossil. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be fossilized. It needs to grow and change and adapt, and that will be what will help the place survive.